Okay, we're going to go, picking up with Ruth chapter 2. Again, I'm going to overlap a little bit back into chapter 1 because that's really where we left off. And there's a couple more items to note there. And I'm sorry about this. They didn't give me a podium tonight, they gave me a table, so I have to be like punching down to make sure that the notes are moving. And I decided I need to stay where we are on your handout instead of me just running loose up here talking. So I'll try to be more methodical and more listed to hang out. So at the very end of chapter 1, you have a section of verse 20 to 22. This is Naomi and Ruth have returned back to Bethlehem. They've arrived at Bethlehem. The women of the town, it's interesting, when they speak, the verbs are feminine. So it seems like it's either led by the women, welcoming, if we want to call it a welcome, or it's just the men didn't pay any attention and it's only the women, which actually, frankly, would fit the period of Judges that we're dealing with, right? Where the men are all pretty bad leaders and nobody really cares about anybody. And the only characters of any nobility in the book of Judges happen to usually be women. So that's interesting on its own. But they have replied, they have responded, "Is this Naomi?" And we don't really know how to take that. I think I mentioned this last time. We don't know if that's excitement. There's a term for when they returned to Bethlehem that the whole town was like buzzing. Something like in the Hebrew, it's a tumult. So it's interesting. They could just be really excited to see her again after so long a time. But my sense is it may not be that. It may be more like, really? She's back? You know, like, why didn't she just stay gone? We didn't need her back here anyway. Her family abandoned Bethlehem in the first place. We can't really say for sure one way or the other. But there's a buzz and a response. And Naomi's response begins in verse 20 of chapter 1. And she just flat out is going to lay it out for them. Don't call me Naomi anymore. Naomi in Hebrew means something like pleasant or pleasantness. And she's just flat out moving on from that. She's giving herself a name change. It's interesting. Name changes happen in the Bible, and they're almost always significant and emblematic of some deep transformation that's taking place. But it's a bit unusual that you would change your own name and then have that just mean something. So that's interesting. And that itself leads to the question of what are we to make of Naomi's attitude here, of her move, her own personal transformation, or let's say the way she interprets herself at this point and the events that have happened to her. This is a pretty interesting question. This is not totally clear to me, and I'll just tell you, I've gone back and forth on this. At first blush, she's pretty obviously bitter. Her statement, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. Call me Mara for the Almighty has made me Mara." It's a wordplay, obviously. He has done bitterness to me, or dealt bitterly with me. For I went away full, and Yahweh has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and Shaddai has brought calamity upon me? That's just her straight up interpretation of the events of her life. And my first take on the surface of it is to think, can you try a little positive thinking here? Like maybe you don't need to broadcast all your problems and blame God right in front of everybody. But I think the more I ponder it and the more I look at the text itself, I think that might be a mistake. Or at least it might be a little too quick to assume that we're supposed to read Naomi as, ungrateful, or she may be significantly depressed, and she may be, in fact, just coming back to Bethlehem to die. Most commentators suspect something like that. But the more you look at this from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, it's actually not that out of keeping with the way ancient people thought in terms of waking up every morning, interpreting events of, say, the previous day to day by day, and then when such calamities have been piled on top of you, at presumably no incitement of your own. It's not clear that Naomi did anything wrong here. In fact, I couldn't find a way to read this where I could blame her for anything, right? It's possible, but I don't really see it. I see her husband as culpable. possibly her sons were bad dudes and they should bear some blame. But I don't really see a straightforward way to blame Naomi for any of this has happened. And when you come upon circumstances like this, again, from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, this language, especially given the language, and this the scholarship points this out, this is not an observation original to me, but the way ancient, especially like Israel's ancient neighbors, the sort of pagan neighbors surrounding Israel, remember, she's been in Moab for a long time. But even within Israel, you have this attitude. And the language of Mara, bitterness, is actually a way you would say, if something bad enough sort of happens to you, or consistently bad things happen to you, that could be expressed with the language of bitterness, Mara, this word here. There's other language that would be brought in for this too. But one of the ways you could explain that is with this language. And it's another way of saying the gods have not granted us a good decree. Right? They haven't granted a good decree for our fate to this day or for this period of time or whatever. That's pretty standard thinking in the ancient Near Eastern world. And when people would say things like that, and you have this more commonly in like Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures where they saw the sun as a deity, and every day the sun would travel. You have psalms like this. The sun travels across the sky. I think it's Psalm 19 that actually uses this direct language. It's riffing on this ancient Near Eastern idea. And then he goes into his tent, right? It's weird. It's like the sun is like a bridegroom going into his tent. And it's odd for us, and maybe just poetic sort of metaphorical language, but for ancients it's actually what they thought was happening. And then at night, the sun obviously is gone. Where does it go? It goes down into the underworld. Makes a little circle, goes back underneath. And down there's a council taking place, and there are like discussions happening. Prayers are being sort of filtered through the mail system and interpreted. And the gods, or the council of gods, something like a heavenly council, they will decide the fates for the people who are asking them for stuff. And then when the sun rises, that's when those decrees are set. And sometimes there's one deity who decrees the fates. Sometimes it's more of a collective effort. But this is pretty standard ancient Near Eastern thinking for Israel's neighbors. And it's clear at points, like Exodus, for example, when they come out of Egypt, and then the first thing that they encounter is this calamity where there's no water. The water is Mara, it's bitter. And they come to the conclusion, well, you brought us out here to die, and now God is against us. We are embittered. It's a way of saying the gods, or in this case our God, Yahweh, has just decreed for us a bad fate. And, that's the way it goes. And it's at this precise point that a lot of commentators, ancient commentators and modern scholarship, will point out Naomi her language and the way she's depicted here looks a bit like Job. And there's language in Job, I think it's Job, I put it in your handout, Job 27. Mm-hmm. Job 27:2, where the sort of somewhat unique use of referring to God, Yahweh, as Shaddai, that's the word in Hebrew. It's usually translated as Almighty. I suppose because translators don't know what else to make of this word, and it's a little bit strange, and I won't get into it tonight. But Almighty that's not really what it means. The problem is we don't really know what it means, so Almighty just is a stand-in. But her use of the term Shaddai to refer to God is the same way Job talks about God. And Job also uses the term bitter. And it's this interesting mix of this might just be the way ancient people thought. If this has happened in such calamitous sequence, what other explanation do you have but that God did it? Whatever else you can say about them. And I'm going to say that's not exactly the way God wants them to see things, but that's a deeper debate to get into. But whatever else you want to say about them, they have a high view of the power of let's say the divine realm to impact events of life. They don't see things as just happening in nature as random or according to a natural process. That's a modern way of thinking, that we divide the supernatural realm and the natural realm, and we say, well, this is just bad things that nature happens to do. Ancients didn't think that way. Nature was attached to their deities, or their deities were their god. Nature was, like everything in nature was represented by a deity, or had some sort of spiritual force or God moving behind and within it. And that's just why things happened. So it seems to me Naomi may just have no other way of interpreting this, even though from a fuller biblical theology, I think there's a better interpretation of her events in her life up to this point, right? So what I'm trying to say is not that she's right in her theological interpretation of her own life to this point, but that she's not totally wrong either. So how's that for taking a stand on an issue? Right? I think there's some room for understanding where she's coming from here, and I've backed off a little bit of saying, Naomi, get over it. You're back in your hometown. Let's just see what we can do from here. Because, you know if you've suffered even just a little bit of inconvenience on occasion, you're like, God, why is this happening? And you kind of intellectually, theologically know that's not really the right question, as if he did it and that's the only possible explanation for things. But we all express that, and we certainly feel it. And I'm not so sure it's that terrible a thing to, certainly not to feel, but also even to express. It's like, yeah, this just seems the way God is doing right now, and I don't. So we could problematize that and discuss it in more in-depth debates, but it's a really interesting response, and I just want to read it for what it is and understand Naomi's perspective. And it may not be crazy, even though it's perhaps not exactly right. So in any case, one more little detail, but I think it actually turns out to be a fascinating upon their return. This is verse 22. And this reads, I'm going to pull up my interlinear Hebrew just to give you the sense of this, because I don't know how all the translations catch this, but it's a bit sort of stilted. So she returned, Naomi and Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law with her, returning from the field of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem, the beginning of the barley harvest. There's this somewhat odd construction here, and it leads to a question of, wait a minute, just who is returning? Right? So Naomi returned, and Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the fields of Moab. Right? An English teacher in the room teaching sixth graders is going to say, you need to rewrite that sentence. Right? It's not clear. And this is a little, I don't know, rule, not a rule, but like a little piece of advice, especially in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. If you're reading through something and you see an ambiguity, like the question pops into your mind, you read it carefully, and you're like, wait, who is this supposed to be talking about? My basic default is an ambiguity in the text is probably intentional. Now, I know this takes some absorption for people to get used to, but I don't think ambiguities like this they can be, but I don't think they're usually accidental. I think the authors are too precise, too careful for that, and they're usually doing something with the language. Now, explaining what's the author doing with this then is a little trickier, but just look with me. Naomi returned, that's clear enough, and Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, okay, that's clear enough. We know what the point of the sentence now is. But that could be the end of the sentence, and it's not. Right? This is the question from a grammar perspective and an interpretive perspective. Why don't you just end the sentence there? Why then say, who returned? It makes it read, if you just kind of take it as written, it makes it read like we're supposed to think of course Naomi has returned, but also Ruth has returned. Which now makes no sense on the surface of that, because Ruth has never been there. Right? How can you return from somewhere you've never been? And I don't have a strong sense of, let me tell you why this is so profound, but I have a guess. And it has to do with this theme of returning, which we talked about last time, shuv. To return is also in Hebrew the way you say to repent. And to describe a convert, right, someone who converts to Judaism as a Gentile, the term you use for that is to make teshuvah. They are someone who has returned. It's like, return to what? Well, I think you have something like that going on here, where the use of the term to return for Ruth, which doesn't on a literal meaning, which on a literal reading cannot make sense, I think it might have some deeper implications for the fact that when she made that spectacular declaration that she will cleave to Naomi, and she will, where your God will be my God, and where you die, I will die, and all of that, your people, my people. I think that is a way of expressing that Ruth has returned in her sort of being, in her heart. She has inwardly returned to Israel, i.e., she's an Israelite. For all intents and purposes, she can now be considered an Israelite. That's the language you would have of, it's anachronistic, doesn't fit the context here in time, but that's the language that will become the way you describe a convert. And once they convert, they make a return in their heart, and they act it out in their, pledge and ritually, and do the things you're supposed to do for conversion. They are then granted full citizenship. They would be considered as Israelites for all, sort of legal purposes. And I get the sense you might have something like that the author just wants to hint that there's a deep truth of Ruth's return to Bethlehem here. It's not just describing that she was geographically here and now she's there. I think it picks up on an inward reality that's only a hint and maybe a very subtle way of getting that point across. But it seems to me, if you don't mean something like that, then this sentence is really strangely constructed. So just a little thing to note, and it fascinates me every time I look at it. In addition to which, they come to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And that's another detail like, okay, that sounds good. Why do we need to know it? And I think this is a deep, deep rabbit trail. I don't want to follow it all tonight. But remember last week I mentioned the whole plot centers on two basic conflicts, two basic problems that need solved. The biggest one is that we've lost the children of this family, so the family name is at risk of being blotted out, as being lost. So the restoration of the name, of the family's name, Elimelech's name, needs to take place, and that can only take place through sons, and the sons have died, so you need to restore through seed, which is the way you talk about, he went into her and she conceived a son. Like the language for that is the man's seed is the way you describe children being born. But the other plot conflict has to do with the land not producing food. So you need to restore the land to fertility. The way you describe that, or the only way that happens, is seed, and it has to grow. And the barley harvest is what I think is going on here is this day, that the language for when they returned, and the fact that we're even told that they returned during this time, this is a particular day in the Jewish calendar that to this day is still celebrated. It's fascinatingly, it's in the middle of the Passover holiday. So Passover begins, and Hebrew holidays start on the same day of the Hebrew month. The days of the week fluctuate, but every Passover, the Sunday, so the day after the Shabbat, the Sabbath day, there was a ritual enacted. It's called the Day of First Fruits, and it's a ritual harvesting. You'd have priests walk from the temple, they'd go down, and they would harvest the first stalk of barley, first stalk of grain of the season. But barley was always the first crop to grow, so it would be barley inevitably. They would harvest it ritually, like the fields have been sowed and planted, they've been growing, but they've just sprouted, right? And that sprout shows, hey, it looks like we're going to have a harvest, right? It's going to be in a few weeks, but a harvest is coming. So as a means of celebrating that, and this is directly from Leviticus, this is baked right into the legislation of Leviticus for that this holiday should exist and how to celebrate it. And they go out and they would harvest this stalk of wheat, carry it up in like a procession back to the temple, and it would be like they would, shake it. The term is usually translated a wave offering. You'd wave it up, or something like, it's a lifting up. You lift it up to Yahweh as a sort of symbolic offering that this harvest, this promise of harvest, right? You can't do anything with a stalk of grain. Maybe a tasty little snack, but it's not anything you can survive on. So it's saying, we're going to pull this out of the ground right now and offer it to Yahweh as a sign of trust. Presumably, this is not all explained. It's in Leviticus, and I'm extrapolating the meaning. But we're willing to take this out of the ground on the promise, on the trust that you will bring more of it later, right? So this is the Yom HaBikurim, the day of first fruits. And that first fruit of the harvest indicates, it's a signal that there will be a greater harvest. The fascinating thing is this is the precise day in all four Gospels, I believe, that Jesus rose from the dead. This is Paul's exact language in 1 Corinthians 15, that Christ, the first fruits, has been raised. And the whole reason he's making that argument is because he will say, and as Christ's people, right, as those in Christ, so we also shall be raised. Because it's almost inconceivable that you would see the first fruit of a harvest come in and say, yippee, let's take this and give it as an offering to God because we know he's going to give us more, and then more wouldn't follow, right? The first fruits indicates, hey, things are growing. Pretty soon this field will be covered in not just barley, but wheat as well, which was the actual cash crop. Like, that was the important thing. Barley was mostly animal food and was cheaper and more durable. But it's like, that's Paul's logic. But it's not just Paul's, like, come up with this. This is embedded into the Torah. And the way God structured the liturgical cycle of how to worship him throughout the year for his ancient people is tied to nature itself. Creation itself bears this rhythm. It builds this ritual into creation so that as they go through their year, their weekly Shabbat, their annual cycle, these thoughts would always have to recur to them through the ritual celebrations, through the ritual enactment. And by the time Paul is explaining that, oh yeah, well, there was a first fruits who was Christ, and since he was raised from the dead, it is inevitable that we shall join him in being raised from the dead. That's not like a clever thing Paul just came up with. It's rooted, it's embedded into the logic of Scripture, into the theological rhythm of just how God works in the world, and that's the logic of the calendar he gave Israel to celebrate their feasts. So this one is just rich with imagery and symbolism in this regard. These women come back here, it seems, on precisely this day. Sort of amazing, right? Just to think about what exactly we're supposed to make of that. And there's a whole bunch more we could say about this, and I just can't explain any of it, but what that kicks off then is that harvest of the day of first fruits kicks off a countdown, a literal countdown. You can read all about this in Leviticus 23, and it's fascinating, and it factors into the New Testament in other ways. But you start counting from that day. It's called counting the Omer. You count the Omer for 7 sevens, right? It's a countdown of 49 days. You're supposed to count 7 weeks, starting on that precise day, at the fulfillment of which time you have the second major pilgrim feast in the Jewish calendar, which is the Feast of Weeks, Hag Shavuot, popularly known to Christians as Pentecost. Penta, because it's 50, and it's a 50-day countdown. It's 49 days, and on the 50th day, you have Shavuot. That's your weeks. You've counted 7 weeks, so you have the Feast of Weeks. We just call it Pentecost because it counts to 50. Deep well here, so again, I have to skip over some of it, but this has implications, obviously, for Acts 2, where there is a major event on this Jewish festival at Pentecost in the early Jerusalem church filled with Jewish believers. And adding to all this, or sort of overlaying it, is the idea that came to develop in Jewish tradition. It's not, so the biblical commandments around this holiday is tied to the agricultural cycle. But in Jewish tradition, it comes to be celebrated as the day that Yahweh gave the Torah to the people at Mount Sinai. So it literally celebrates the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, which in Jewish interpretation, Jewish tradition, is seen as a marriage nuptial ceremony. It's God taking Israel as his bride. And they agree, I do. All that you have said, we will do. That's seen as a marriage, the joining together of Yahweh with his bride, who is Israel. So all these marital themes and the acceptance of the Torah and the fulfillment of what happened on Passover, right? Remember, this begins on Passover week. Now, you start to think about, it's also It's also associated with King David's birthday. It's said that this is the day King David was born. This is a weird thing in Judaism where people's, especially prophets, their birthdays are always also the days they die. Or not always, but it's common. It's very weird, but this is associated with King David. So all this, and for other reasons, it's just a curious little detail. You have a book, a story, about a Gentile woman who will become a bride of a powerful Jewish redeemer. And that's the language that's used of Boaz. In a moment, we'll meet him. And the consummation of this is sort of leads to the Davidic dynasty, right? So King David is literally born out of this union on the day that Jews would come to celebrate the birth of King David. So it's Davidic through and through. We've talked about that on week 1. And then just the imagery of all this, like a Jewish bride or a Jewish groom and a Gentile bride being joined together. It's and all this comes to fruition on the feast that we see this event in Acts chapter 2 that we think of as the beginning of the church, the bride of Christ who comes to be predominantly Gentile. It's, you don't know exactly what to do with all this, but it's hard to ignore, and it's just one of these layers to the story that, we could build a lot more off of this, but I just want to put it out there to start to see some of these some of this connective tissue. What we will get into in the story, especially tonight we get into chapter 2, we'll begin to look at this, but think about the way Israel accepts the Torah, right? You give us all these commandments and whatever you say we will do. And then how do they do at that job? Right? Not so well. Everybody else, it's very famous even within Judaism. It's like, well, yeah, we didn't really do a crack-up job there. Boaz becomes a sort of embodiment of how it looks when you actually live out the Torah faithfully. And this is another Jesus connection for me because obviously the parallels between Boaz and Jesus are pretty evident to New Testament readers. But on a deep level, he seems to me to be one of the best examples, and we'll look at this as we go, of when Jesus says things like, you've heard it said, right? And then he'll quote the Torah. But I say to you, or and I say to you. Which is not to say you've heard it said in the Torah and that was wrong. But it's to say you've heard the Torah said this, and I also say you have to go beyond that, right? And what we would come to understand is basically that he's teaching some version of you need to fill up the spirit of the Torah, not just obey its letter. And certainly not pretend to obey the letter of the Torah and then be rotten in the most important ways that God cares about. Boaz I don't know that there's a better example of that in Scripture than Boaz. And we'll get to some of that. So I just want to lay that all out here quickly. But I do want to get into chapter 2. So let's move on to there. Let me read chapter 2. We've covered chapter 1, and I spent a little too much time reviewing it, but it's really fascinating, and it's kind of important to kick us into chapter 2. Okay. So Ruth 2, let's start at verse 1. Let me just read the whole chapter. We'll come back and hit this head first. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered. I'm just going to read this from the ESV, but we'll come to the strangeness of verse 6 in a moment. And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. Then Boaz said to Ruth, now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land, and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out for her some of the bundles, pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Okay, if you followed along there in the translation I put in your handouts, or if you had a different translation, we'll get to some of there's a lot of sometimes challenging ways, you confront the Hebrew and it's just challenging, and sometimes I think it's again one of these, there are just brilliant little details in the way that the story is told that you can only dig out by looking at the sort of brilliant and beautiful use of the language here. Let's start with this. The first we see of them in Bethlehem, these two women. The story shifts as if to just say, let's dig. It's an introduction of Boaz, but it doesn't actually introduce him. So now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a man of valor of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Okay, that's awesome. We want to hear about him. And then verse 2, there's nothing to do with Boaz. And the story puts Boaz off for a few more verses. Wait, what? And I think that's clever, right? You get the reader, the audience to hear, oh yeah, Boaz, we kind of know, we want to meet him. So let's introduce him in verse 1. And then let's not introduce him. Right? Let's tell you about him, but not show him to you yet. It's unavoidable. I don't know if this is good or bad, but I've come to read, especially stories like this in the Bible, sort of like cinema, sort of like movies. Like I'm a big movie fan, and I try to be I'm like a wannabe film student, film critic student, and it just doesn't work. I'm not very good at it, but this strikes me as a good cinematic move, or like building drama, right? Let's tell you about Boaz, but not show him to you. Well, then what's the next thing you're wondering about? Okay, can we meet him, please? But the way he's introduced is interesting and important. The language to introduce him, he's called an ish gibur hayil, a man of great, I like valor. That's the way the ESV translates it. That's come to be my go-to. But this word hayil has a range of meanings. Like the semantic range on this, it can mean a lot of things. It's boring story for everyone, but I'm working on my Hebrew, like I'm developing my grammar and trying to learn self-taught Hebrew. Been at it a while, but it's really slow going. So don't ever get the impression like I read scholars and I can tell you what things mean, but I have my Hebrew. But I'm watching back in the Israel-Hamas, at the start of the Israel-Hamas, where I'm watching this major that they always put on TV from the Israeli army, from the IDF, to explain their policies and stuff. And I'm trying to make out what's on his pocket, right? They're military uniforms, and I'm like, I can pronounce that. I'm very proud of myself. And it says Chayil. And I'm like, wait, I know the word, but I can't. I'm like, Chayil is the way in modern Hebrew you say a soldier. You just identify a soldier. It's used this way in the Bible. For military ability, sometimes soldiers, fighters, warriors are described as Chayil, Gibor Chayil, mighty men of valor. So it's interesting. But it can also refer to wealth, high status in society. And it's like you meet Boaz, or you don't meet him yet, you're just told about him. It's like, oh, well, we wonder which of these he is, right? Is he some warrior that's retired, but he's known for his skill in battle? That's possible. Is he wealthy? That seems likely, but we don't know. Is it just to say he's a man of substance in the social circles he runs in? He's well respected. That's also possible, and seems. I think we can verify that by the end of the story. But I'm going to suggest the author introduces it. He tells us about Boaz using this language, but doesn't describe Boaz at all. And I think what we're supposed to do with Chayil in this case is to watch and see what he does. And that will tell you what kind of man should be described as Chayil in this context. So I'm going to argue that all of those other meanings should be on the table and are probably true in some sense, but that what the author means to say about Boaz is that he is a man who is Chayil in his character, right? In his devotion to Torah and to Yahweh and to the way he will treat other people. And I just find that. Now, another detail about this is this almost exact language. All the language is here, but it's slightly, the word order is slightly changed. This is also used to introduce us to King David. This is just in your handout, 1 Samuel 16. Yeah, 1 Samuel 16, 18. Among the first mentions of, like, when we're introduced to David, one of the young men answered. This is Saul asking, like, hey, get someone over here. Provide a man for me who can play well. He needs a musician. David's your guy. One of the young men answered, behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing. Oh, and also, he's a man of valor. Right? He's a Gibor Chayil. It's the exact same language. So it's probably not accidental that the author of Ruth uses this language, because he wants David to ring in your head. Right? That's just a little addendum, but probably intentional. It's one of these things that the author tends to do. Now, we'll come back to this, because the same term is going to be used of Ruth in the next chapter. And I think that's an intentional, what do you say again, a literary mirroring, like linguistic mirroring. They're meant to match each other. The language matches one to the other because their character is perfectly matched. They're mirror images of each other. The masculine and feminine ideals, you could say. One more detail, and we'll pick up this when we get to chapter 3. The main place everyone knows this term from is probably, in Christian circles, Proverbs 31, right? Mm-hmm. It's translated there usually something like a woman of valor. There's an Old Testament scholar I have a commentary from Proverbs. He interprets it in Proverbs as a warrior woman. It's like, that's kind of cool. Mm-hmm. It's totally accurate to the Hebrew. And what the chapter there, what the poem in Proverbs 31 seems to be getting at. But obviously she's not out fighting, people in battle. But I like that idea of depicting this woman as a warrior of virtue, right? And so more on that as we keep going, but let's return to our chapter here. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain. after him in whose eyes I shall find grace. That can be taken as a request. Hey, can I please do this? You're the matriarch here. Would this be okay? Or it can be taken as an assertion. I'm going to go glean in the field. Standard way to read it, I think, is a request. I think that makes sense. I'm not sure it's the only way that makes sense. Ruth may be like, if we sit here like this, we're going to die. Someone needs to go get some food. I'm going to do it. Right? And again, we don't know the dynamic of Ruth and Naomi and their personal relationship. So it's hard to say which one we should prefer here. But just know it can be taken either way. And Naomi just, again, she's very terse. All her answers are very short. Go. But it's still affectionate. Go, my daughter. So we're always left wondering, what is going on with these two? Are they close? They love each other? Is Naomi just putting up with her? But whatever you want to say, Ruth, I think, recognizes she is Naomi's only chance. If she doesn't go get food, it's possible Naomi's too old to do this. We don't know exactly how old she is. It's possible she refuses to do it because it would be such a social embarrassment, right? She was a woman of status in this community, and now 10 years have gone by, or at least 10 years have gone by, and now she's back with nothing and destitute, and she's just embarrassed. She's not going to subject herself to that shame. I'm going to go glean like a poor person. That seems likely too. We just don't know for sure. But in any case, that's not what's most important. The psychology and mental state of Naomi is not what's that important to figure out. It's the bold character of Ruth, who's just willing to go and do whatever needs done on behalf of her mother-in-law. And that's a little tip-off as to what you're going to get out of Ruth as the story unfolds. So, go, my daughter. It's curious that Ruth knows that there are laws in, again, Leviticus, you have in your handout, Leviticus 19, Leviticus 23, in the same passage that details the celebration of Hag Shavuot, Feast of Weeks. The very end of that passage is a law that stipulates, by the way, when you harvest your fields, don't harvest to the very corners. You just leave the corners for the poor and the orphan and the widow. And Ruth is at least two of those three things. And it's curious that she either knows this law, which would be pretty remarkable, given that she's a Moabite, who taught her this, or it's enough of a ancient custom that she's like, this is how things work in most of these agrarian societies, and she just knows. But it's interesting. She's going to go with some knowledge that if God's law is being followed, as it should be, I will be able to get food for us. That's interesting, right? It's a certain amount of faith on Ruth's part to just volunteer to go do this. Not, among other reasons, not least because, remember the period we're dealing in here. The time when the judges are judging. Almost nothing good ever happens to a woman through the whole book of Judges, and sometimes unbelievably terrible things happen to women, right? So I know, let's just go wander around and find a field and hope that some guy will show us grace. That's her language. In whose eyes I might find chen, favor. I might find grace. That's either really a bold step of faith or it's dumb. Like, you wouldn't want your daughter doing this. So it's just an interesting little insight into Ruth and the kind of character she's going to be proven to become. Question right there, Steve?
I'm just thinking, a field of crops. Typically, the edges aren't the prime crop.
Right.
Like in corn, the first few rows, you really don't do much with them because the corn isn't that good. So a lot of that could have been, hey, that's not prime crop, we'll leave it for whoever wants it.
Yeah, it makes sense. And also, I think, the spirit of that laws like it is, you don't need to fully maximize your profits if you're going to be a community, a kingdom that represents God and his wisdom and his love and his provision for people. Then if you're a businessman, or if your family survival depends on this crop, don't try to, strap every ounce of profit out of it. Because that would lead to a society of a disparate society where some are just left without anything, and that's not the way God wants his community to work. So they're profound, these laws of the Torah, and we'll keep talking about this as we go. But yeah, there's a lot of sort of practical wisdom in why you would run things this way. And then there's some deep spiritual truths embedded in it. And Ruth goes out with this practical wisdom. You better do something. And also maybe there's some deep spiritual truth working here. Why did she expect any grace to be out in Bethlehem at this time of Israel's history? It's not clear. It's not clear if she does expect it, or she's really naive, or she just has some deep level of faith working that says, my only chance is grace, so I'm going to go find it.
Which I find really fascinating because she's relatively a new believer.
Totally.
I mean, it's this level of intensity that it's pretty...
It's unexpected.
It's very unexpected.
It's not the kind of person you expect to know exactly what to do at exactly the right time and, do it with such faithfulness. It's a really beautiful setup to more that is to come. Another comment or question back?
It seems to me that she says, whose eyes I shall find grace. She's referring to Boaz. Because the mother says, she says, here's this guy who's, really cool. And then the next sentence, she says...
There's an aspect which, of course, you're right. In the story, she is obviously speaking of Boaz. She doesn't know that. She can't know that. It's the narrator in verse 1 that says, oh, by the way, there was a man, right? And we know him to be Boaz. And the author tells us that's who it is. But Naomi and Ruth are not thinking, they don't apparently know dealings with him. They don't know, like Naomi obviously knows who he is, but has no reason to think, he's going to come to our rescue. So you're right in the meta sense of, as the story's unfolding, the Ish Gibor Hayil, we know that's going to be Boaz. All right, where is he? Awesome. But Ruth cannot know that. She's hoping for some guy, some man who will show her grace. So it's one of those yes and no. That is true from a narrative perspective, but on the ground, they don't. It's a total leap of faith. And maybe a really naive and stupid one. It's going to put her at physical risk.
Yeah.
It's a little bit daunting to think about. But all right, so there's this verse 3. And this is another thing that translations smooth over, but I'll just pick it for you real quick and not comment too deeply on it. There's this beautiful thing that the Hebrew Scriptures do. It's often in poetry, but often just narrative storytelling, but it's written in this... Robert Alter is a scholar. He calls this parataxis, but don't mind that. It stacks these verbs together. So at the beginning of verse 2, and she went, and she came, and she gleaned. In Hebrew, it reads almost exactly, it's like, there's almost a rhythm to it. V'talek, v'tabo, v'tarlaket. It's like, it intentionally reads, it puts the and in front of each word. And she went, and she came, and she gleaned. And translations will often smooth that out, because it's like, again, redundant, and you don't need it. But it turns out, I think, it's a device of Hebrew writing. And again, remember, a lot of this would have been heard, not read on the page, and so you'd hear that, there's almost a force to it, right? And it seems like, again, think about that sentence in English. And she went, and she came? Came where? And she gleaned. And so, and there's some interesting, probably to this day, my favorite commentary on the book of Ruth is written by a Jewish Israeli scholar named Yael Ziegler. And she argues, and I'm going to cite her a lot, I may forget to cite her, but I learned a lot from her. One of the insights she has is, it seems to her one of the reasons to say it this way is it might be picking up a sort of intentional process, but it's very busy. Like she's going from field to field. And she went here, and she came there, and she went, right? She went, and she came, and she gleaned. She's going about looking for any field she can find and seeing what can she make out of this. And that's, again, couldn't say for sure, but it's a bit of a unusual way of writing the sentence. And again, it's like, what does that mean? She came, and she went, and she gleaned. And it sort of stacks these verbs up, and it seems to be something like that going on. But in any case, what's fascinating, and this is the storytelling feature that I mentioned a couple weeks ago, the author does this couple points. And when she did that, she went, she came, she gleaned, she happened upon the field belonging to Boaz. And this is a little clever wink by the author, right? He's like, he's going to tell you the story as if events just unfold by happenstance. It literally in Hebrew says something like, she happened to happen, right? She happened upon a happening or something like that. That's often what you do for, you reiterate the verb for emphasis and for this kind of thing. So it's depicted as, through and through, and almost every event has this quality to it throughout. Every major turning point or events in this book have this quality of being presented as a chance encounter. For the people in the story, it just so happened to work out this way. Right? And the author knows you're going to get that is not the way you're supposed to theologically read this story, but it does present an interesting perspective on just how are God's people in such a terrible situation. How can they be expected to resolve these problems with good outcomes by trusting God? And the answer is some combination of, we'll just watch how God works, but we're not going to tell the story that way. We're going to tell a story like you need to go and let things emerge. And that's an uncomfortable place to be for a lot of people, and certainly a lot of Christians. And I'll say deeply uncomfortable for most of the way I live my life, for me. I don't want to just go let things happen. I want to control the way things happen. But the story does not teach that lesson. It teaches the lesson over and over again. That you go and you do and you trust and you risk and you let things emerge. It's a profound insight. And it's just a sort of brilliant, clever little way of telling this story. It doesn't mean that there are random accidents happening all over the scriptures, but it does leave the door open for what is the role here exactly, the interplay between God's people trying to live out his word and God's provision for them in a broken and fragmented world. And those are deep questions, covered all throughout the Bible, but the way the book of Ruth covers that question is just unbelievably interesting to me. So I'll keep coming back to that, and I'll keep noticing things like that. And behold, Boaz, and that's almost literally. This is one of the phrases that I really am sad we don't use this language anymore in English, right? I wish we would go around saying, and behold, right? I found this meat on sale. It would be so much better. So I love that. And it's all throughout the Hebrew Bible. V'hinei, it's the word for... come back to it. But this pops up over and over again. V'hinei, and look, and just then, right? Or something like that. But I just love the old, behold. It does so much work. And I wish we spoke that way, but I love this. And behold, Boaz, like, wait, what? Now, I don't know if it's normal during this type of harvest season for the owner of the field to just randomly show up. This strikes me as slightly unusual. I don't know for sure. Maybe you just got to keep an eye on things. That seems plausible given the era of Judges where almost nobody's honest and everybody's rotten and nobody's faithful. You better keep an eye on your field. So I think that factors in, but it's just interesting. Now, the first words Boaz speaks is key. First, we actually get to see and hear Boaz himself. We've heard about him, and then we're just told, hey, behold, there he is. The first thing he says is key. Because the name of the Lord is in his mouth. Right? First words he speaks. Yahweh bless you. And that's going to tell you an awful lot about a man who's almost a singular example in this period of Israel's history. The fact that he shows up with Yahweh's blessing on his mind, his heart, and in his speech is a deep truth that tips you off to who you're dealing with here. Right? You already know he's going to be a man of chayil, a man of valor. First thing he says confirms that. So what is his valor? So far what we know is he's a man of valor because he's a man of Yahweh. And that says a lot. It's, again, Yael Ziegler, fascinating insight here. I've heard no other commentary point this out or offer the possibility. And not certain, but she says, there is a way, it's possible to read this in Hebrew as either he's speaking a blessing, may Yahweh be with you, or he's asking a question. I've never heard this, and I just want to credit her with it, because I think it's really interesting. I'm not sure it's right, but it's interesting. He could be asking this as a question. Hebrew has no punctuation, has no question mark. You just have to infer questions from the context. What if he's showing up and saying, is Yahweh with you in what you're doing? Right? And her point is, this could be a challenge to his workers. Hey, are you doing things the way you're supposed to be doing them according to Yahweh's Torah, according to the word of the Lord? And I wish I could prove this, because it's fascinating as an option to me. It fits better the context of the period of Judges, when there are no trustworthy men around, and he might well have to worry about, how are you operating my business? So in other words, if he's coming and challenging them with the question, is Yahweh really in what you're doing? Is he with you? Then their answer to him, Yahweh bless you, is not just a response, like a liturgical response. It says yes and may also. It could be, yes, boss, we're doing what you told us to do, which is follow the Torah, leaving this grain for the poor, etc. And we're conducting ourselves honorably, so you can expect Yahweh will bless you. Right? He's going to produce more from your crop because we're doing it right. That's the covenant. That's the way the covenant worked. And it's an interesting possibility. Like I said, I wish I could prove that more fully, but since I read that in her commentary, I can't shake it. I'm like, that's a fascinating rereading of this that may well be the way to read it. I don't know. But in any case, it doesn't matter. Boaz is clearly identified as a man who has Yahweh sort of in his heart and his words on his tongue, and also likes to distribute blessing. Wants to make sure things are done according to the way of blessing. Now let's close with this, and then I'll shut us down here. Verses 5 through 9.
Just wait.
Pause for you.
Okay.
As it very awkwardly reads in Hebrew. This is very strange, but it's important. I put this, I think I put it literally for you in your handout. But if you have your Bible, whatever translation it is open, none of them will look like this. And it's so bizarre. So let me just read it for you as it is sort of structured in Hebrew, literally. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And that's a strange thing. And he doesn't say, it actually says, "To whom is this young woman?" It's almost like, who does she belong to? We don't know if he's asking about her nationality, who's her dad, who's her husband. All of those are options. We don't really know for sure, but just not sure. And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the field of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now." Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't translate this. Okay, sorry, let me pull it over in the Hebrew text. Okay, this is so weird. "And she came, and she stood from then, the morning, and until now, her sitting in the house a little." It is literally what he says. And you see why no English translation can write it that way, right? It is literally an incoherent sentence. This guy has just stumbled over his response. And it's very hard to know what to make of this. And all the translations do some work to try to say, well, we think it might mean something like this. It's showing her industriousness. She only took a little break. We don't know for sure. There's a fascinating theory put forward on this, and I don't want to overwhelm you with very arcane theories of Jewish interpreters, but a rabbi named Moshe Miller has a commentary on Ruth as well, and he actually says, and again, I wish I could prove that this is true, I don't know for sure, but the very incoherence of the sentence means you've got to interpret it somehow, and nothing really makes good sense of it. His argument is that it's possible Boaz is asking after Ruth's welfare. He's a little concerned. What's going on with her? He may also be interested in her. Like if he's asking about her husband, it may be an indication, well, maybe, does she have a husband, right? Not sure of that, but his servant might be responding with scorn. Oh yeah, she's a Moabite woman that came back with, Naomi, the family, that family. She's the Moabite woman. And Moshe Miller's theory is in the middle of his response to explain, how this dirty Moabite woman got into your field, because he's responsible here. And he may think Boaz doesn't want a dirty Moabite woman in his field. So he starts to answer according to with appropriate scorn for the Moabites. Mm-hmm. But somewhere in mid-sentence, he sees that that's not the question Boaz was asking. Boaz does not share his opinion of this woman. Boaz already knows about Ruth. He's going to tell us that. And mid-sentence, this guy has to change his answer. Whoops. If I keep running this woman down, boss is not going to like it. So he just stumbles over his words, and it comes out as an incoherent mess. Now that's as good a theory as I've heard, because nothing else makes any sense. The servant seems to me pretty clearly not to have a good opinion of Ruth. He's annoyed that she's here, and she's a Moabite, and he's just not a fan of what's going on here. But we know from the response, that's not how Boaz feels. So somewhere along the line, this gets all jumbled up. And in the middle of this, right, the guy finishes his broken sentence. It doesn't make any sense. And then what's the next verse? What's the next thing that's said? Then Boaz said to Ruth. Mm-hmm. He just ignores his servant. Right? How did this conversation start? Boaz comes. Behold, Boaz. He asks his servant a question. His servant starts to give an answer and then drifts off into some incoherence. And Boaz is just like, I'm going to talk to you. Right? He just ignores this guy. I think that's profound. Right? It's really interesting. Says to Ruth, now listen, my daughter. Affectionate term. Bati, my daughter. He doesn't know this woman. He just met her. But this affection is the first thing he gives her, is attention, which apparently no one else is giving her. And if they do, it's scorn as a foreigner, an immigrant, maybe woman of suspect character. But he gives her attention and affection. Listen, my daughter, do not lean in another field. Don't leave this one. Keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field they are reaping. Go after them. Now, have I not charged the young men not to touch you? He's already got this under control. But that also hints that he knows the danger to a young woman in this environment. And he's taken care of it. And this is a man, again, what kind of man of chayil is he? It's a chayil of character. It's the valor is in his care for the stranger, the marginalized, and in this case, the woman who may well be at risk of some sort of physical or even sexual assault. And it's just a really moving picture of how to treat, again, living up to the Torah's laws about this stuff. Yes, go ahead.
All right, you said that Boaz doesn't know Ruth, but in verses 10 through 13, he says, I know all about you.
Yes, he does know about her. He has been told this story. Or he has, he has advanced intel about Ruth. He seems to be observing the situation from afar, but he's not met her in person. So he presumably hasn't met her yet. He doesn't know her by sight because he has to ask his servant, who's this? Like, what's going on with her? To whom does she belong? So the presumption is he hasn't seen her or met her, but he is gathering information. He's aware of what's going on in his community, and he's heard about her, and specifically about what kind of woman she is.
So when he calls her my daughter,
yeah,
it's obvious. It seems to me it's obvious. It's based on what he already knows about her.
I think so. Yeah. He intentionally shows affection to her because he knows. Think about it. Her situation makes it obvious to anyone who's willing to learn about her situation. She is in need of someone. So is Naomi, and we're going to get to that. But he seems to be approaching her as if to say, I will take care of you as a father should. Your father seems to not done the job. You have lost your husband, you've lost your father-in-law. No patriarch. I can do that. Right? Here, he's only doing it in the ways that are available to him in the short term in this immediate situation. But I think it's another hint. He will become the patriarch for not just Ruth, but for the whole family, because it's what needs to be done. And it's what Yahweh calls his people to do. It's how he calls them to live. So it's just a remarkable introduction to this, almost too perfect character. But again, you're not supposed to read Boaz for his psychological depth as a character. You're supposed to read him as a stand-in, and we'll get to more of this as we go, but he represents Yahweh almost in the story. Yahweh's not directly involved in performing any actions in the story, remember. But he does it through proxies. He does it through his images. And Boaz is sort of the supreme image of God, with Ruth as his counterpoint. They're like exact mirror images of each other because they both image God in this full and beautiful way. Mm-hmm. Yep, go ahead. We'll take some questions here.
Well, I'm a little confused because he says, whose young woman is this? In other words, he doesn't know it's Ruth. And then it goes down here. It says, have I not ordered young men not to touch you? Well, that means he gave the men, don't touch any woman.
Yeah.
So he's not specifically saying to you, Ruth.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. What it looks like is going on here is, again, you have a translation issue. When he says, I have ordered them not to touch you, I think maybe more helpful here is to render that he is at this moment, in present tense, he is declaring at this moment no one is to touch her. He's making a declaration, not explaining a decree he already made. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You with me? So it is what he's saying right now, publicly. Mm-hmm. It's not just he speaks to Ruth. It's that he is saying loud enough for everyone around to hear, no one is to touch you. That's the way I think it works, because that's a really good question. It's like, when did he say that? Did he have this all planned out? And it doesn't seem like that. What I think is going on here is no, this is his declaration that no one is to touch her.
Not just not touch any woman.
Well, I mean, you assume a man like Boaz has a standing rule for his employers, but think of the impact here. He's speaking to Ruth. He's the first one who has even given her any attention and affection. And as he's explaining to her, here's what you should do. He would, this is the way I picture it anyway. Don't go to another field, stay in this one, follow my young women around, and his voice gets louder by orders of magnitude so that everyone else now hears. And I am declaring right now that no one is to touch you, right? Everyone within earshot hears him say that, and imagine the impact on Ruth, right? She's running around looking for a field to glean in. She's hoping this one will work. She's met this guy who's really impressive. The servant is looking at her with, like side eye. And all of a sudden, she gets a public announcement made to her, but about her. And it's just like, oh, I can breathe easy.
Maybe it was specific because she was a Moabitess. Because maybe they said, well, don't touch the women, but that doesn't apply to that Moabitess.
Good point. They wouldn't have had a good reputation anyway, so that's a good point, too.
So Boaz is of Naomi's family.
Yes, related to Elimelech, it seems.
Elimelech, right.
But yes, he's the...
So his family, so he's heard of Naomi's plight through the family.
Somehow,
Now
yeah.
here they are. Here's Ruth. What I find interesting is Ruth is not family. She's a daughter-in-law. So she's a Moabite that's married into the family, but now the husband's gone. But he recognizes her as family and calling her a daughter.
I had a question of kind of a
Okay,
follow-on
that's-
comment too about that.
It's another one of those examples. In the story, you're right. He will become family, and he seems to recognize that. But it could also just be an affectionate way of referring to a young woman. right? Colloquialism of
Could it
sorts, but
be-
it's a good point.
Could it be also that the fact is that he's aware that she has cleaved to Naomi and has become an Israelite?
Seems like it.
And so the affection now is, you're one of us, you're a citizen, as you mentioned earlier.
Seems like it to me, and we'll get to this next week where this encounter picks up again. Yes, what it looks like is
She's been adopted into the nation,
yes. So
culture.
he will treat her as if she is family.
Yeah.
Now she is the one who is going to say, "Wait a minute, why are you treating me like this? I'm a foreigner." Like she reminds him that she's a foreigner. He doesn't care. Or if he cares, maybe we could say it this way. He seems to care because she's a foreigner. Right?
Wouldn't that
That's
be nice?
amazing. Think about that for a minute.
That would
You
be
could
nice.
say, well, he's pretending like she's not a foreigner, which is really a generous thing to do, to just bring her in as family. But it's another step beyond to say, no, I know. It's because she is a foreigner. And that's precisely the kind of thing that God addresses these laws to provide for. Right? Remember, you were slaves in Egypt, and you were foreigners.
Yep.
That's precisely why that recognition matters so much. So more on that next week, but it's a really important point, and it's just the kind of insight that the more you sit and meditate on this text, it pops out to you. Oh my goodness, what kind of man is this? Right? And who does this? Especially in this, again, period of the Judges, where the answer is nobody. They're all pretty bad. So yeah, good, really good questions. You guys are reading, with a sharp eye, and it makes me happy. So, all right, let's formally close it down here, and we can talk some more if you like. But some of us need to get out of here, so I want to respect that. Lord, thank you for your word again, and for the insight that you offer us, and for the beauty of this story and all the ways it can impact us. We pray that would be the case by your Spirit as we go tonight and throughout the rest of our week. So, in Jesus' name. And for his sake, we pray that you would bring these things into reality for us on your behalf. Amen.